Well, today we will start to give a brief outline of how human thoughts, main lines of human thoughts have developed over the ages. My attempt will not be to recount the entire historical process or even history of science. What I will basically do is to recount how various lines of philosophical thoughts have evolved in society and how these have influenced the advancement of science. And in that course of discussion, let us start with the almost advent of the humanity. As you know, the species Homo sapiens sapiens arose some 2 lakhs years back. The timings are not yet very well confirmed, but more or less you can assume that. So, anatomically modern humans evolved around that time, and what are known as behaviorally modern humans, humans that could make tools, had articulated speech, and some kind of a social organization, that appeared something like 40,000 years back. So, our story starts from then. And from that time, like 40,000 years back till now, for out of this period, 3/4 of the period was spent in a kind of society that was basically hunting gathering society. So, their source of sustenance was hunting and gathering, 3/4. So, it is very large span of time, about 30,000 years. In this time, people had to move from place to place in search of food. In one forest, if the food got depleted, they had to move to another place. So, it was basically a moving nomadic kind of life, no settled life, no village, no cities. So, the human society was in that stage, and there are certain very clear findings of anthropologists regarding societies of that time. By studying modern people who are still in that, there are aborigine people who are still in the hunting gathering phase of the society. By studying that, people have come to the conclusion that in that kind of a society, everybody had to do almost every function. Everybody had to take part in hunting, everybody had to do everything. So, there was no division of labor, as it is called today, and there was no concept of any personal property. Everything belonged to everybody. The things that they brought from the forest, the hunted animals or the fruits, whatever, if you cannot eat them now, they will rot. So, there was no question of storing them, and naturally there was no question of somebody becoming rich, somebody becoming poor. So, everybody were basically on the same footing. So, that was the kind of society at that time. Now, at that time, people were constantly in touch with the nature around them, the trees, the wind, the water, thunder, mountains, rocks, so things around them. And they had to constantly in struggle with the natural forces around them, because they had to eat and they had to avoid being eaten, and that was the constant struggle. So, their constant interaction was with the natural things around them, and naturally their thoughts revolved around the natural things, material things around them. And that is why anthropologists term their mode of thinking as primitive materialism. Primitive because it was primitive, but materialism because it concerned material things that they saw around them, the tiger, the lions, the trees, the fruits, the mountain, the river, material things around them. The whole thought process revolved around them. It is true that at that time they were afraid of certain things, afraid of the thunder, afraid of say rain, afraid of various things, the rocks falling on them from a mountain which might kill them. So, they would try to sort of please these things so that they do not cause harm, and they chanted, they painted their faces, they danced in peculiar ways, and all of that was aimed at pleasing what they figured are the natural forces that might cause harm. These are also not any idealism, these are effectively primitive form of materialist thinking. In the next stage, we see the advent of agriculture. We did not go into how it started, but it started more or less around 10,000 years back, in some places 8,000, some places 7,000, but around that time in the Tigris Euphrates plains in the main, but it spread in other places quite soon. Now, when agriculture started, there was a radical transformation of the social structure. Firstly, in order to do agriculture, you have to sow the seed, you have to reap the fruit, and naturally you have to be there. So, you have to be settled in a place. So, settled life developed, and settled life means villages, and as the number of people increase, slowly it would take the shape of towns and settlements essentially. And earlier, as I said, that the things in the hunting gathering phase that they ate, those things unless you eat them then they would rot. So, nobody could store them. But in the agricultural phase, the agricultural produce in the main food grains could be stored, as a result of which some people subjugated the others, got control of the food grains and also the land, and thus there were some people who had the food grains, had the land, some people who did not have the food grains, did not have the land, and so what is known as class division started. Not only that, there were always fights between clans and tribes. Earlier, when if a clan won over another clan, the members of the vanquished clan did not have any use for the victor clan. But now, after agriculture started, they could be used. They could be forced to work on the land, and naturally in that stage we find for the first time people being chained and forced to work on the land, and therefore, what is known as slavery started. And as some the clan chiefs thus defeated other clans, increased their territories, and finally, through that process slowly we find the birth of kings and kingdoms. Earlier there was no king, no kingdom, but now there was the birth of kings and kingdoms. So, with the kings and kingdoms and their army, the machinery of subjugating other people, slowly a stable form of society emerged, in which there were slaves, there were people who owned the slaves, and there were some aristocrats, there were some kings, nobles, that kind of a society emerged. Not only that, as agriculture started, it is easy to see that in one piece of land or one kind of area, not all possible food stuff can be produced. Some places are good for producing grains, some places might be good for producing meat, some places might be good for producing fish, and so on and so forth. So, naturally there was a need for exchange. Initially these were in the form of exchange only, that means when I produce my food grains, I give it to you, and when you produce your cotton, you give it to me. So, that was kind of barter exchange, but soon the kings started acting as intermediary, as sort of guarantee that if you give up your food grains now, at a later time he is guaranteed to give you the meat or cotton or whatever he or she produces. And slowly the means of that exchange took birth, namely money. Money was the guarantee given by the ruler, the king, that if you give up something now, you will get something else later. And what you have now is in exchange is that piece of paper or that coin, which is a guarantee from the ruler that he guarantees that you get the worth of it. So, money came into being. As trade started, large volume of things had to be transported from one place to another, and earlier things were transported on people's head, but now larger volumes of things had to be transported, and so the natural inventions happened. The wheel was invented, carts were invented, and before that there was no wheel, there was no cart, but after that we see advent of wheels and carts and relatively larger volume of transport. When people were just roasting meat and eating or eating fruit, they did not need any cooking, but the food grains had to be cooked, and naturally they need pots. So, pottery started, and as you understand, pottery needs some kind of a fire, and one needs to make earthen pots by some kind of a turning process. So, pottery involved many different processes, including fire burning, and through that various different processes of pot making started. Pottery actually was the basis of many different inventions, including metallurgy, because in the kilns where the pots were made, something was burnt, and naturally it is a reducing atmosphere. A reducing atmosphere can reduce any ore that can be present, and through that process people notice that copper, tin, zinc, if mixed together makes a relatively stronger metal. Thus, bronze age started, and at a later stage when people noticed, mainly in the Asia Minor, where the iron ore is available on surface, so that the kilns were often made of this material, this kind of clay. They noticed that sometimes iron would be obtained simply because whatever they were burning had carbon in it, a reducing atmosphere, so iron could be formed, and that technology soon spread in many parts. So, the iron age started. So, metallurgy also was a product of the invention of agriculture. Earlier people had to count only the number of animals in the forest, say 2 animals, 3 animals. So, the number was essentially 1, 2, 3 and many. But now, since people were in possession of farm animals, cows and other things, cows, sheep, goats, so one had to keep a count of them. So, larger numbers had to be counted. Not only that, when agriculture started, land has to be measured, and land does not always come in whole number units. So, fractional numbers had to be conceived. So, in this stage we see the advent of larger numbers, fractional numbers. Not only that, the kings and nobles who had relatively larger amount of property, they had to keep track of their property. How much is coming, how much is going. So, accountancy is needed, and they needed to keep track, means they needed to write down how much they had, how much of what they had. And through that attempt, through accountancy, writing started in different forms in different places. And for that purpose, one had to learn how to add, subtract, multiply. So, arithmetic in rudimentary form started. Not only that, even geometry started, because they had to store the grains in the granaries, and depending on the shape, geometrical shape of the granaries, you have to figure out how much grain is stored there. So, that requires some idea of geometry. And so, all these developments happened over a time after the advent of agriculture. Thus, around say 600, 700 BC, we see a stable form of society in the Iron Age starting, stable form of society with all these things that I have just mentioned in place. In the next stage, we have to now go to certain civilizations. Most important among them was the Greek civilization. Its start happened not in mainland Greece, but in the islands and in the coastal areas of modern day Turkey, which is adjoining Greece, in those places. And those places were not rich enough to be subject of invasion, but at the same time connected to the earlier civilizations in say Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in India, so that they could cull the knowledge that was developed there. So, ultimately in Greece we find refinement of knowledge. Most importantly, it was a slave owning society. So, there were some people with enough time in their hand, because they did not have to engage in day to day activities of earning the livelihood. The slaves did that job. So, there were some people free enough to think and think only. And in that time we see the advent of many philosophers. In the early phase, important among them was, for example, Thales, Anaximenes, we have Empedocles, we have Pythagoras, and people like that. I will not describe their entire philosophical points they made, but what I will just point out was that, for example, the question that what is everything made of, that was a natural question that everybody had, and everybody were thinking about it. Thales thought that everything is born out of water. So, the things that we see solid are essentially born out of condensation of the water. Anaximenes thought that everything is made out of air, and water that we see around is essentially condensed form of air, and other things are even more condensed form of that. So, everything starts from air, and he thought that the sun, the moon are all floating in air. Empedocles thought that everything is made of 4 constituents: earth, water, air and fire, and that idea went on for a long time. So, with this you notice that it was subjective mode of thinking, they were thinking on their own and coming to their own conclusions, but noticeable is the fact that the basis of their thinking are the things around them: air, water, fire, earth, material things. So, at that stage also the basis of their thinking was materialistic, even though subjective. But in the next stage, as slave owning society matured, people had nothing else to do other than thinking. A condition was created that was conducive to the creation of idealism, and I will come to that. How and when it started, it is difficult to pinpoint, but we see some characters, some important people who give it a shape. For example, Pythagoras, everybody knows the name of Pythagoras, Pythagoras theorem. Even though the Pythagoras theorem was not really due to Pythagoras, because it is definitely true now, we understand that the ancient Egyptians knew about it. They could not have constructed the pyramids without idea of the Pythagoras theorem. The Indians knew about it, at least a statement is there in the Shulva Sutras. The Chinese had even proved the Pythagoras theorem. So, Pythagoras did not really invent that theorem or prove that theorem. but he was responsible for many other advancements of mathematics. For example, figuring out that there are not only rational numbers, but there are also irrational numbers was their contribution. He created a group of mathematicians as sort of a secret sect who did mathematics in an isolated place, and it was shrouded in mystery, and they would not let anybody know what kind of mathematics they were doing. We know about what they did from other people's writings, but we know that their mathematics was of a sort of mystic kind. They assigned certain mystic qualities to individual numbers, 3 having a particular quality, 2 having a particular quality similarly. And for example, they thought that 10 is a perfect number, ideal number, a perfect number. So, anything in the heavens have to be 10, but at that time only 9 of the heavenly bodies were known. People thought that they knew only 9 bodies. 5 planets, Earth, Sun, Moon, and the celestial sphere, as it is called, was also considered. So, that way there were 9 bodies that they figured they knew. And in order to make it 10, the Pythagoreans imagined sort of a something like something called a counter Earth that is there, but that is never seen from the northern hemisphere. That is there as another heavenly body. They figured, they thought there is some ideal geometrical shape, and they figured that the circle is an ideal geometrical shape, and therefore, anything in the heaven should be in circles. So, the things were moving in circles, they thought, and every heavenly body must be a sphere, perfect sphere. So, you see, whatever things are, that was not the subject of thinking, rather whatever things should be, because there is some ideal shape, ideal geometrical figure, some ideal number, and they tried to impose that ideal things on physical reality. In the next stage, you see, the Greek civilization is divided into 3 phases. The first phase is called the Ionian phase. Second phase is called the Athenian phase, where the center of activity moved to Athens, and the third phase is called the Hellenistic period. After the demise of Alexander, his empire broke down, and then some generals took the relatively eastern part, and another general took the western part, including Egypt, and center of learning shifted to Alexandria, and that part at that time, the time is called the Hellenistic period. In the Athenian period, the great philosophers Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were there. Now, Plato, I will start with Plato because what I am trying to point out has bearing with him. He picked up those lines of thought of the Pythagoreans, that there are ideal shapes, there are ideal numbers, and then Plato said that there are ideal, you can think of ideal everything. For example, a rose. It's a rose, if you really take a rose and examine very carefully, then you will find some imperfection in it, here or there. But you can always think of a perfect rose, a perfect beautiful rose. So, they were making the point, he was making the point that a rose, you can think of a perfect rose, an ideal rose. So, there is something ideal, and what is really existing is something inferior to that. And similarly, he said that you can think of an ideal society, you can think of an ideal ruler, you can think of an ideal everything. Those things that come to your idea are more powerful than things that actually exist. These are more real than the real things. Now, this had very far reaching, this line of thinking had very far reaching influence on posterity, because once it is accepted that whatever you can think, that can be trusted, that can be believed, that can be propagated, and so there was at that time, after Plato, in the age following Plato, there was a plethora of different belief systems sprouting. Some man thinking up something, telling others, getting some followers, that started a line of thinking, another person had some other thought. So, different kinds of belief systems. And the way of thinking in that time, as I told you, was subjective. So, there was no question of checking if any belief is correct or not. So, there was no check, everybody believed. So, there was various belief systems. And after though at that time it is not true that this form of idealism that Plato generated, that idea is prior, matter is secondary. This was not the only line of thought, because there were also people in ancient Greece who were doing, trying to do at least hard science. Aristarchus and Hipparchus were astronomers. They were trying to do it naked eye astronomy. They were trying to figure out the structure of the heavenly bodies. Archimedes, for example, he worked out the laws of the simple machines like lever, pulleys, and things like that. So, that was grounded in reality. So, there was the current of materialism still there, but the current of idealism was slowly gaining ground and taking the shape of various belief systems. And after the Greek period, the Hellenistic period, we know the Roman Empire took shape, and that sort of ruled almost the whole of Europe for a long time. And finally, when the Roman Empire was disintegrated, there was a series of invasions from different places, the Goths, the Vandals, and people like that ravaged Rome, and finally, the Roman Empire disintegrated. By that time, a few things had happened. Most important thing that had happened during the Roman Empire around 70 BC was the slave revolt. The slaves revolted under the leadership of Spartacus. There was a slave army formed, and that army challenged the Roman legions, and there was a war for about a year, and finally, the slave army was defeated, and all the slaves taking part in the about 100,000 slaves were killed. But that event, even though that was a failure revolt, that sort of started a change in the society. People were wary of another slave revolt, and slowly the form of society changed. Earlier, the slaves were made to work in the fields, and there were slave owners who also owned the land, but now the landowners changed their strategy. They gave pieces of land to different people and said that you till this land, and ultimately when there will be some agricultural produce, I will take 2/3 and you take 1/3. And through that, another form of society called feudalism started. So, slavery gave way to feudalism in much of Europe, and in that form of society, you see, in the slave owning kind of society, the slaves have no incentive in increasing production. But in a feudal society, the serfs who till the land, actually the poor people, they had some reason to try to increase the production, because their 1/3 share will also increase. So, through that, it was a relatively advanced form of society, even though peoples were still in wretched condition, but still it was a relatively more stable form of society. And in that stage, we see a new kind of society taking shape, where the villages would be self-sufficient in most respects. All the things that are necessary for the villagers will be produced in the village itself. Every village will have a cobbler, an ironsmith, a carpenter, and people tilling their lands, producing vegetables as well as the cereals. So, everything that is needed in that village would be produced in the village or close to the village. As a result, self-sufficient village economies developed. And if it is self-sufficient village economy, then trade and commerce subsided. And if trade and commerce subside, there is very little exchange between areas, then closed form of economy develops and closed form of culture also develops. So, the culture also becomes stagnant. In that society, since about say 900 AD, the time of Charlemagne, a kind of society developed that was a stable kind of society, a society ruled by the dual rule of the king and the church, which propagated certain beliefs. Out of the belief systems that were created earlier, some belief systems were integrated into the new church belief systems, and the whole kind of society thinking was believe, do not question. So, belief system developed. The belief system was so very strong and prevalent that there was a belief that this, you see, Aristotelian thoughts, the Ptolemaic thoughts were all integrated into that belief. So, the structure of the universe was that the center of the universe was earth, because that is the abode of humans, men, which is the product of God. So, it is at the center of the whole universe. Around that the moon is going in circles, the sun is going, and beyond that, according to the Aristotelian beliefs, there would be the crystal spheres on which the planets would be embedded, and God would be moving that crystal spheres, so that planets would be moving in particular ways. That was integrated into the belief system. And at the end of the whole thing was the closed dark canopy, the ultimate sphere on which the stars were embedded. And that is the area of the perfect and unchangeable, nothing can change there. So, that was the belief, and believe, do not question. That was the kind of thinking. As a result, in the year 1054, a very peculiar thing happened, a star exploded. And the star exploded, it was in our galaxy, not very far from our solar system, and naturally it became very bright at some point of time. So, over a period of time, it will become brighter and brighter, a star, and at its peak it was almost as bright as the moon. But we do not see a single writing, single person of that period writing that I have seen that. Why? Because we cannot see that, there cannot be any change in that sphere. It is the realm of the perfect and unchanging. So, that was the belief, and nobody believed their eyes. We know about that incident in 1054 from writings in China, which is at the same kind of latitude. So, that system, that closed kind of system, belief systems, was propagated for about 1000 years. And finally, that started breaking up during the, and started being questioned during the period of the Renaissance.